I could tell you how to write a novel and I could tell you how to write a play. Not that you would necessarily follow it, but I still don't know how I write a song. I always equate it to a hammer hitting an anvil. There's that moment when it hits and sparks come out. That's when the melody and the words really combine. And that happens in a real magical way. With playwriting and with novel writing, you got to put a lot into it. I'm doing one on Iraq at the moment, a musical, and I was up at 6 this morning. It was 6 till 4 o'clock. That's 10 hours. I didn't stop. Hi, Priscilla, how's it going?
Good.
How are you? Where are you today?
I'm in Soho in New York.
Okay. Where you've been for quite a while, huh?
Yeah, I've lived here for about 30 years.
I wanted to talk about that, the Irish sensibility, the Irish coming to New York. It seems like everybody comes to New York. Like there's something special about New York. Is it something in the water?
It was the capital of the world at that point when I decided to come.
Right.
But also, where I lived was pretty close to England.
Right.
And I didn't want to live in London at the time. Most of my peers would have gone to London because it's just so simple.
Wait, you didn't want to go because of the tension?
Yeah. Politically, I didn't agree with the English government, so I didn't see the point in going to live under them. So.
Yeah.
But Shane MacGowan went to London, but Brendan Behan went to New York. So it's what's the thing about New York for poets? It's something special. Yeah, Dylan Thomas. Is it something about the immigrant experience?
Yeah, I think it's that you can reinvent yourself. You can be whatever you want to be here. At that point, everyone in Ireland was Irish. It's a little changed now. And so to come to New York, you're going to be dealing with people from all over the world of different backgrounds. And that really appealed to me.
Right. What was your feeling about Yeats?
Oh, I still adore Yeats.
Yeah.
I've used him a lot. I used him, but used different titles. Like Fanatic Heart, I got from his poetry. Yeah, anytime you get stuck, you just open a page of Yeats, you'll find something on there.
Yeah, what is that thing? What is it about Ireland that, I mean, it's such a strong thing that sort of comes through Yeats, and like there's a spirit in it, and it does have something to do with New York because a lot of people come to New York.
But it's not just Yeats, I would say. The tradition of Irish storytelling is extraordinary, and playwriting as well. So
you see, the Irish didn't write novels. We wrote poetry and, of course, plays too. Novels came much later. Of course, Joyce probably wrote the greatest one. But yeah, I'm a playwright, and then I became a novelist because it's easy to do on your own.
Right?
Yeah. And not easy. Writing novels, I think, is the hardest thing. But
I mean, it's a hard question to ask. But what is it? The culture, the land, the fight, the grit, the hardship. What is it that breeds this incredible historical legacy of just incredible poetry, storytelling? Just like in the South here, you go to the South and you'll get a similar. There's a pocket of a place in the South, the Deep South, where the storytelling the novels are extraordinary. What do you think about this?
Subjugation, I think, living next to a big imperial power in Ireland. And in the South, it was slavery. People actually owned other people, which is, to me, is still kind of a startling thing. We're dealing with it in Paradise Square, the play I have or the musical I have on Broadway now. But just actually that you could own another person and feel okay about that.
Yeah. When you first came to New York, had you already seen the Sex Pistols, or was the Ramones the first thing you saw that was that?
I think it was actually David Johansen's band, the New York Dolls.
Yeah. Boy, they were incredible. Oh, and where did you see them? Because did you see them at CBGB's, or did you? Well, no, they weren't really there. They were at that other club.
I saw them
at Club 37 or something.
Actually, I live on Mercer Street, and there was a place called the Mercer Street Arts Center. It was and it collapsed after a while. But I remember tripping, doing acid, and going in there and seeing the Dolls. I was like, oh my god, these guys dress like women too. I thought everything was. It was startling, yeah. I mean, they looked like good-looking women too.
Yeah. But you also went to CBGB, so sort of you were between two periods, yeah?
Yeah, and I knew Hilly. See, I used to play in a place called the Bells of Hell on 13th Street.
Right.
And the original CBGB's was across the street.
Right.
So we were doing big business in there. I was in a group called Turner and Kirwan of Wexford.
Right.
And Hilly wasn't doing big business. So he used to come over and see us, and we got to know him. And then when he went to open the place on the Bowery, it was a big jump because the Bowery was rough in those days.
Right.
We were the first band to actually play there. We played played for the opening night there. We thought it would never take off. We said that to Hilly. He hired us on Mondays and Tuesdays for about a month, and it's hard enough to get people to get out on a weekend, but to go to the Bowery on a Monday or Tuesday, we said, this joint's never going to work, Hilly. And then we went to Ireland, we came back, it was bouncing. We played there then, it was a great place.
And what were all those bands like, seeing Talking Heads and the Ramones? I mean, did you have a feeling for each one, or did you?
One thing I always recognized about Talking Heads was every time you saw them, they got better. Mm-hmm. That's not always the case, but every time I saw them, they got better. And I said the first time I saw them in CBGB's, I was thinking, I don't understand this. And I was taking a pee down in the urinal, and right next to me was David Byrne. I remember saying to him, what is it you're doing with this music? And he said, you know something? He said, we're trying to be like everyone else. We're not very good yet. And I always wonder, was he joking me because he's very intelligent, or did he mean that?
Yeah. And do you feel like New York is different than that spirit of New York? Because now CBGB's is a John Varvatos store. It's kind of a different vibe.
I couldn't actually pass by it for the longest time. I used to go to the other side of the street and stare in the windows as I was passing by. It's only the last year that I've actually looked or stood in that doorway, because that doorway meant so much to me. I met so many people outside, the memory of it. I didn't want to affect the memory. I found that if you change the physical around a particular place, you forget the original physical. And I didn't want to forget CBGB's.
Yeah. Do you think that's ever been captured well, the actual feeling of what was in there?
No, I've never seen it captured. I'm not saying it hasn't been.
Yeah.
It was a unique feeling. It wasn't that friendly. The bartenders weren't friendly. The drinks were kind of warm, and it wasn't a great place, but up around the stage, you knew you were seeing new things all the time. And when you got on that stage yourself, it was, you felt really a part of something. Mm-hmm. And I didn't always feel that. I was more of an individualist. I never wanted to be part of a movement or anything, but there in CBGB's, I really felt a part of history.
And did that make you want to write Liverpool Fantasy? That idea of what was possible? Is that something to do with what could have happened if the Beatles came back together?
Yeah, Liverpool Fantasy came more from the song Please Please Me, which was the first hit in England. And just hearing that coming out of the cloth-covered radios we had, you could feel that there was something changing and that there was a whole new something about to happen. And then it occurred to me, because I was into science fiction back then too, that what would have happened if something happened during the recording of that song and it was never released? Would there have been a 60s even,
Right.
So that's a big idea, right? One song, a few phrases can change the world.
And I was able to write a play about it that became pretty popular. And then I even wanted to explore it further and did it as a novel, because I wanted to, in plays, what you're trying to do is get rid of language and give it over to the actor. In a novel, you're trying to expand and get into the heads of the characters. And I wanted to get more into Lennon's head, not the Lennon that you saw in America, but the teddy boy Lennon, who I knew a number of guys like him that were really brilliant and yet had this self-destructive part of them, and they never amounted to anything. And John was very like that too. I remember a guy telling me once he saw him kick someone in the head from the stage in the cavern.
Right.
And, he could just as easily not have made it, John Lennon, and the world would have been a different place.
Yeah, that's true. You write about the Bronx, did you spend a lot of time there? And, again, it's all Irish characters.
I found the Bronx through the Catskills.
Wait, that's
okay.
like
you got lost.
Jewish vaudeville.
Yeah.
Tell us what happened. How did you
Well, there's an Irish part of the Catskills too called East Durham, and it's near the town of Catskill.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a big summer place. And the band I was in, Turner and Kirwan of Wexford, we were playing in Falmouth in Massachusetts.
Right.
And
one of my hometowns, by the way. Okay.
Yeah, all right. It's a great place. Yeah. But we got fired there. We were playing in a place on the beach.
Right.
It was called the White House. And
right.
I know that place. Well, why did you get fired?
I can't remember exactly. We had an argument with the owner, and we never thought he'd fire us. But we were here illegal at the time and everything too. So. I think it was probably over pot, smoking pot upstairs, and we'd been warned not to or something like that.
Right.
But anyway, we were fired with no money. And I knew this guy who was a nephew of the Clancy brothers.
Right.
I gave him a call. I knew he was in East Durham. And he said, "You're not going to believe this. You people are just so disorganized." He was a great friend of ours. So he always thought Pierce and I we smoked too much pot and everything. And he said, "The band that's playing before us just got fired. If you can get your butts here tonight, you can have the gig for the summer." And we went up there and we caused a big stir in the summer. And a guy came up to me one night and he handed me a card and he said, "The second week in September, the Saturday night, I'd like to book you guys in the Bronx."
Right.
Here's my card. This is maybe in July.
Right.
So we showed up. I found the Bronx eventually. We were living on the Lower East Side. It wasn't that easy to get there. I couldn't get over it. This area of the Bronx was like being in Galway on a Saturday night. Everyone was Irish. So I began to play up there, and then in the various bands I was in, if things ever went wrong and you needed money, we would go to the Bronx and get a gig there.
Right.
And that's how Black 47 started too, is in the Bronx.
Right. What's the name refer to?
1847, the worst year of the potato famine. And in Ireland, if you said black, it meant it was bad,
Right.
It had nothing to do with the color. It was the darkness.
Right. Right.
So it was kind of like we used it in the same way that the Jewish people use "never again."
Right.
Holocaust.
Use it in the Holocaust. We use it in the same way for the famine.
So your radio station's very unusual. I mean, I grew up on that kind of music. That's all they played in my house was kind of Irish music, maybe the Weavers and things like that. Just all sort of music like that used to be on all the time. But how did you come up with that? And how do you think about it? How do you think about your radio show?
Celtic Crush.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was up doing an interview with Meg Griffin. We were really old friends from the East Village scene, and we were laughing a lot. And when the interview was over, we were out in the corridor and we were falling around laughing at various things. And one of the bosses came by and he called her over and he said, "Is this guy Irish?" And she said, "Yeah." And he said, "Can he talk?" And she said, "Put a couple of whiskeys in him and see what happens."
Yeah.
He said, "Well, we need someone to do a Celtic show. Would he do it?" So she came over to me and I said, "Sure. I've never done anything like it before, but I'll do it."
Now, how do you find out about all those songs? And do you do it and it starts to mean more than when you started? Because you've been doing it quite a while, so you must enjoy it.
I've been doing it for 17 years.
Yeah.
Can't believe it. 17 years exactly. I do enjoy it because I treat it like a gig.
Right.
Because that's the way Black 47 worked too on stage. Even though I would write out a set beforehand, we were free to change the set or even do the arrangements different any night we felt like it. So I treat it like that. The more you do it, the more you learn about different styles of music. So I'm able to tie them together better now than I probably was at first. But also, as you know from growing up around rebel music and folk music, it's transmitting stories and history. Because the Irish and the Celts in general, for long periods, weren't allowed to go to school to learn English or whatever. And so they passed on their knowledge through songs.
Right.
And I was always into history. I'm able to tie in the song with the particular historical events that were going on at the time that the song was written. And then not explain it to people, but lead them into an area where they can think, because I'm not telling them what to think. I want them to think for themselves. So here is a set of circumstances in this song. Now I'm giving you my version of it, but go away and think about it yourself after.
Tell us about Rockaway Blue, how that comes to be, that your experience, and then how did your experience in New York shape that story?
Well, for your listeners, Rockaway Blue is the story of the Murphy family from Rockaway in New York City, which is right by the sea, by the ocean. There's the father, Jimmy, who's a Vietnam vet, who's a detective sergeant in the NYPD, and his wife, Maggie, who's a Catholic school teacher. And he has two sons, one of whom is Brian, who is brilliant from the time he came out of his mother's womb, is into poetry and is a mover up the ladder. And then there's the other son, Kevin, who's not. So come 9/11, Brian is in the North Tower, saves 7 people, and then runs back in. The tower collapses on him, and nobody can believe it. He's always led this charmed life, and the family is shattered. And then a couple of years later, just as the family is gathering themselves a little bit, Jimmy, the father, finds out that Brian was actually in the North Tower 30 minutes beforehand on his day off. What was he doing there? And he suspects a cover-up, and he sets out to find what the cover-up could be. But at the same time, he's torn, because if he finds out something about Brian that's not good, then the mother will revert back into depression again. So it's one man trying to find the truth about 9/11 within the story. But the story is there to talk about the people, not just who died during it, but the people who survived. So many of them I know and are still dealing with the pain of it. It doesn't go away. It's there. I even find it, because I live over by the west side. I was just down there today, and I don't look at the Freedom Tower when I'm close to it. I can look at it from a distance, but as I'm passing by it, I don't like remembering it. And I had a couple of close friends who died in it, but to have a family member, it must be so tragic. And what I was trying to do really is to tell the story through the eyes of the regular people of New York, not the professors or the politicians or the journalists, but to a regular person.
I think that song, Fairy Tale of New York, the Pogue song, it's such a beautiful song. Is it really about New York, or is it about the whole experience of being an immigrant in New York?
Yeah, well, Shane is just such a brilliant writer. He's, he brings together so many things in that song. The loneliness of immigration, but yet finding a place for yourself in New York, even if you're down at the bottom of the barrel and you're in jail, and as he's singing it, that you have a place within the society here. And I think that's what it's about.
And do you think that's that's always been true of New York, even going back to the Dead Rabbits and all the not bands, but gangs of New York,
Yeah.
Because there's so many Irish people here then,
Yeah, well, the Irish were the premier immigration group for 40, 50 years. Italians were next, Jewish after that, and it's been so many different nationalities since then. But they're the three you tend to hear about, those three groups. For the Irish, it's always been a source of fascination to me, being Irish and being here. And yet I didn't live in an Irish community. I came straight away to Avenue B and 3rd Street, which was a center of heroin dealing at the time. So it was very different than being in the Bronx or something. But I think having that little bit of distance, I'm able to look at my own people who are here and, study them.
Do you think New York, do you think that it's still comforting or embracing of immigrants now? I mean, the world has changed so much, in the last couple of years, really, even exponentially. So do you feel that it's still that hub?
Yeah, New York is. And, other cities. I spent 2 or 3 months in Chicago with Paradise Square recently. And yeah, it's the same. Trump did a real disservice to the country by allowing the stupidity level to rise here, because this is an immigrant country. It always has been, and it stands or falls by the immigrants who come into it. Yeah, I think it mightn't be quite as welcoming to certain peoples, but in general, you're given a shot in New York and you're accepted if you can fit in and do your part for New York.
Now, what do you prefer the most, writing songs, writing plays, or writing novels?
The song is still the most difficult. Well, I could tell you how to write a novel and I could tell you how to write a play, not that you would necessarily follow it, but I still don't know how I write a song. Mm-hmm. I always equate it to a hammer hitting an anvil. There's that moment when it hits and sparks come out. That's when the melody and the words really combine. And that happens in a real magical way. With playwriting and with novel writing, you got to put a lot into it. I'm doing one on Iraq at the moment, a musical. And I was up at 6 this morning. It was 6 till 4 o'clock. That's 10 hours. I didn't stop because you got to take all these characters, keep them in your head, and make sure the story is clear, and yet at the same time have drama and comedy, so many things in there, and then you got to fuse the music with that. But at the same time, that's easier in ways than writing the song, because you're waiting for the hammer to hit the anvil.
I have a question for you around, a lot of your career was like in small places, dark, wild, just, I'm going to say drunken brawl. Who knows what was going on, right? And then you also, but you go from there, but you bring Hard Times to Broadway, for example. What is that experience where suddenly, going into this other world where you have rules and people come in, and what's that like to then see your work in a different way, like very proper? What's that like?
Well, once you've been into the dark places that you describe so well, where there's anarchy and everything.
I've been in those bars, by the way. I've been in there in New York.
Right. Yeah. So you're in these places. I had to, for instance, because I used to sing with my eyes closed, and one night up in Albany, I got hit with a microphone that knocked a tooth out in the back. Because the mosh pit came on stage, and I didn't see it. And wow, it's like blood is coming out all over me. Once you've dealt with that kind of world, that you're trying to put some shape on the anarchy. Broadway is not that much harder. Broadway has its rules and everything, and they can be a little frustrating and whatever. But you find that you know how to deal with it. Once you've dealt with the wild world of rock and roll, you're not going to get shot on Broadway.
Not yet.
We've had shootings at our thing.
Well, we don't know. Anything is possible these days. We don't know. God willing, you're not going to get shot on Broadway.
Yeah.
You had a shooting at one of your shows?
Yeah, one St. Patrick's night, a police officer shot himself by accident, and I didn't speak about it for many years, but the bullet went up he was up in the balcony, and it smashed into our road manager's wife's hand, and then went down along the seats and went into my wife. So it was just once you dealt with something like that, Broadway is not that hard.
What did you do?
Well, I didn't know it until after we were playing at the time. I could smell the smoke from the gun, but I didn't think it had anything to do with me. I mean, it was scary because at that point there was I wouldn't say a fatwa out on Black 47, but there was we had been warned many times that we shouldn't be making such political statements about Northern Ireland. So the first thing is we thought we were being shot at, but seeing we were all still standing, there was only one bullet. We knew that we were safe. But yeah, it wasn't a good St. Patrick's night, let's say that.
Is there a lot of, in New York, what's the relationship between the Irish and the police? And because you're very involved in that. A lot of your work has been around that, the 9/11, also going back and playing the bar and having some of these cops come in. And what is and where does that come from? Is it protection? What does it mean, the police and Irish police in New York?
Well, in Black 47, Chris Byrne, the uilleann player, was a detective sergeant. So that was fairly unique. It was unique for me anyway, because I had been in Lower East Side bands where, the cops were not the most favored people. So I had to come to terms with the fact that here's one of my best friends is a cop, and you learn a lot. The whole defund the police thing, I never got that. It's like, if I'm being attacked by someone, I want a policeman there. I can see why certain communities have trouble with it, but I think that's reform the police, not defund the police.
Yeah, okay. No defunding the police. That doesn't.
Yeah, you need, in New York City, you need it. And I will say with this new mayor that I've noticed on the subways now, you actually see policemen again. And you didn't for so many years.
Is he doing good or bad?
I think he's doing good because he's of the people.
Yeah.
Remains to be seen. I mean, what is he? He's 3 months in. We'll see. But, he knows the streets as long as he stays sane. And he came to the opening night of Paradise Square. So I'm a little biased.
Larry, what are you really excited about? What right now, the work you're doing? Let everybody know, because you have a lot going on, just where people can find out about what you're doing, what you have opening, just to kind of give everybody a way to understand and read your work and listen to your work and watch you and all of that.
Well, Paradise Square is running on Broadway at the Barrymore Theatre on 47th Street right now, and hopefully it'll run for some time. I'm working on 3 different musicals. One which I describe as about Iraq, the story of what happened over there. Another one is one you mentioned before, a new look at Brendan Behan, the Irish playwright, through a musical. And the third is an East Village one. It's a story of 2 people who are romantically involved in a band in the 80s. They get a break, they're about to go on Letterman, and the guy doesn't show up for it.
Okay, don't tell any more. We don't want anyone to get ideas. That is a fabulous log line. And just for the audience, I mean, to have a play on Broadway, people, like, that is a serious thing. That is really, there are very few people that make it through that needle. So the eye of the needle there. So that's extraordinary. It's so exciting, and what a wonderful life we're having.
Yeah.
Well, if you come to New York, and I had rough times here, but I always had a great time, no matter even when I was totally broke. There's just something about the streets of New York. I can never get over people going around New York with headphones on. It's like you're missing the
music.
The music of the streets. I mean, your father, his music, I could tell his music. When I heard like a Rolling Stone for the first time, it opened up a vista of a world. It's like everything came together in that recording. There's even a mistake on there that people don't realize sometimes. Just coming out of the third chorus, somebody makes a mistake and it's there. Nowadays, mistakes are gotten rid of, and that's rock and roll.
I think you're right.
No more mistakes. People can't make mistakes to get in trouble or canceled or something. But
Black 47 was a band of mistakes. So.
Amazing. Larry, thank you.
Thank you so much, Larry. Really a pleasure. Love the show. I listen to the show all the time. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you so much. And when I get to New York, it must be so exciting. People are getting back into the theater. So super wonderful.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Bye, you guys.